So along with the changes that happen in the reward system during this time in development comes a new physical body that's also doing really interesting things. Puberty is a separate process, happens at about the same time as the remodeling of the dopamine structure or dopamine system, but it's the process that leads to reproductive maturation through the production and release and activities of the sex hormones, which are estrogen for girls and testosterone for boys. The physical changes that result because of those chemicals are obviously important, but what I want to talk about today are the changes, the really important and powerful changes that happen in the brain as a result of puberty. In order to do that, I want to talk about another chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a chemical that's released from one neuron to another. It's released very powerfully immediately after a woman gives birth, in both the woman and the father. And the point and the message that's conveyed by oxytocin is that we need to bond with this new baby, with this other person. It sends a social bonding message to say that this is really important, that you pay attention to this person and bond with them. So what we see with puberty is very interesting. We see a proliferation of oxytocin receptors in the amygdala, which, if you remember, is the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions, fear, pleasure, and in a separate part of the brain that's actually called the pleasure center of the brain. And so why is that important? Because with oxytocin comes the desire to bond. And so if you have more of those receptors, that means you're going to have a higher capacity and the signal to bond, to tell you to bond, is going to be that much stronger. On top of that, you have estrogen and testosterone surging through the body, and what those chemicals do is actually increase the power of oxytocin transmission from one neuron to another. So what you get is a message that's very loud and very strong in adolescence that says to bond. And unfortunately, or fortunately for them, it's selective for peers. And so they are driven by this biological process to bond with their peers. And if you think about the power of a bond and an attachment between a baby and their parents, you can see that if you apply that to adolescence, it starts to help us understand the power that we see in the intensity in those in adolescent relationships. The other thing that's really important is that because there's an overlap remember I said that there were oxytocin receptors in the amygdala and the pleasure center. There's an overlap in terms of bonding, social bonding, as well as the reward system. And so in the adolescent brain, bonding and being socially accepted and socially taken in is processed in the very same way that rewards are processed. This can help explain why often crimes that are committed by adolescents are committed in groups of adolescents most often, because that kind of social acceptance, which comes from taking risks, is a very powerful motivating factor. I love this slide because it shows the intensity of the emotions of a teenage girl who is standing next to someone that she's very bonded with through his music. I'm not sure if you are familiar with who this young man is, but he's Harry Styles, who's one of the members of a boy band, One Direction, who often elicits very strong emotional reactions from his fans. What I love about this slide is that she's actually not standing next to Harry Styles. She's standing next to a wax figure of Harry Styles in a wax museum in London. The emotional reactions of mostly teenage girls who go to this museum was so strong that the museum actually had to hire an attendant to stand there with tissues, because girls frequently break out crying when they see Harry Styles or one of his other bandmates. I think this is a great example of the kind of irrational and very powerful emotional reaction that can happen because of bonding between peers. What's especially important and interesting about this is that it's not even the real person. It's a perception of the real person. And that's so important for adolescent development, because so much of social acceptance and social rejection has to do with the perception that that person has, which can be just as powerful as the real thing. I mentioned social rejection. That's actually processed not as a reward like social acceptance is, but processed in the amygdala in the same way that a physical threat to your safety is processed. And so that, for me, helps me understand the intensity of emotions that you see in adolescents after a breakup or after perceiving that they've been isolated or rejected by their peer group.